Hello, friends. How are you? Ready for another story? Sit comfortably and let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it. Write in the comments which country you are watching this video from and what time it is. It will be interesting to find out. Let's go. The rain had been falling for so many days that people stopped counting them in numbers and started counting them in sounds. On Graymarket Street, the rain was a hiss against neon. On the river, it was a drumbeat on barges. On rooftops, it was a million soft fingers tapping, 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 while lightning stitched quick silver scars across the low ceiling of clouds, and thunder rolled like furniture being dragged across the sky. In Harbor City, weather was not background. It was the language everything spoke. At 11:57 p.m., Leela Quinn stepped into Studio B with a steaming mug, and the ceremonial creak of the old door, the ON Air sign, glowed a tranquil red, one warm ember in a city of cold water. And beyond the glass, the control board glimmered with green LEDs, like tiny rivers of light. 3 minutes until midnight. 3 minutes until the hour that belonged to her alone. Midnight Harbor was the name of the program, a late-night slipstream between news and dreams. And Leela liked to imagine the city tucked under its damp blankets, listening. Thunder murmured somewhere to the south, closer than the hour before. And when she curled her hands around her mug, she felt the vibration in the handle. She'd written the opening earlier in a spiral-bound notebook. The paper crinkled from the humidity, but as the clock clicked to 12 o'clock, and a blue-white flash pulse-pictured her reflection in the studio window, she did what she always did. She trusted the storm. "Hello, friends," she said, voice low and warm, the smile audible. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." She paused, letting the condenser microphone drink the soft rush of water against the building's gutter, letting the hush widen until the city leaned closer. Out there, the streetlights look like moons caught in puddles. Out there, umbrellas are planets in orbit. We are safe in here together. Tonight, we begin with the night the signal returned. It was an old radio superstition. In the heaviest downpours, frequencies went astray, straying like cats through alleyways of static. For the last 2 weeks, the station's rooftop antenna had been temperamental, going dark whenever lightning scored the clouds directly overhead. Harold, the station manager, muttered about budget and grounding. Leela muttered prayers into her tea. She had built her small life around this hour, tender as a candle in a cavern, and the rain had been threatening to blow it out. At 12:06, the phone line clicked. Line 1. A whisper hissed, and then a voice arrived like a warm coat. "Midnight Harbor." "Welcome," Leela said. "You're with Leela." A chuckle then. "We all are at this hour." The man's voice had a shoreline quality, the kind carved by waves, a little broken, a little polished. "I wanted to tell you something about the rain." Please do, she said, touching the fader as if it were the rim of a glass. The thing about storms, he said, is that they remember. Not us, maybe, but places. The corner by the bakery, where the drain always clogs. The roof where the cats hide. They come back to the same places because those places keep their shape. Tonight, I saw lightning strike the harbor crane, and for a second, the whole sky had bones. Leela smiled into the mic. A city with bones, she said. I can feel it too. What's your name, friend? A beat. Rain flared against the window like a shaken bracelet. E, he said finally. Call me E, thank you, E, Leela said, and meant it. The switchboard's tiny light glowed steady, and then went out. She pictured him in a doorway with his phone cupped in his palm. Rain slicking his knuckles. Thunder approving quietly somewhere behind the warehouses. She pictured his coat darkened, his hair dripping at the edges, and a small smile that only arrived for secrets told to strangers. At 12:15, the signal hiccuped. Static crackled in her headphones like crumpled paper. The meters quivered and fell. Out on Gray Market Street, the streetlight opposite the studio flickered and died, leaving the rain free to be nothing but rain for a breathless few moments. Leela set down the mug, slipped out of the chair, and went to the window. Below, one story down, the narrow alley that separated the station from the bakery's shuttered side door had turned into a thin, earnest stream running toward the river. A flash lit everything white, the kind of flash that leaves the world printed on your eyelids. And when the light fell away, someone was standing in the alley looking up. He raised a hand as if shading his eyes from a sun that did not exist, or as if waving hello to the thunder. Leela tilted her head toward the studio door. Harold, she called. Only the air conditioner answered, laboring bravely. She tugged on her raincoat, the honest yellow kind with big buttons, and slipped her headphones down around her neck like a necklace. In the hallway, the station's walls murmured with different lives. A sports show 2 doors down arguing about a postponed game. The weather desk farther along muttering numbers. A jazz record turning in studio, A like a slow galaxy. When she reached the back stairwell, she found it cool and smelling of metal and damp. The emergency light hummed like a bee. Leela descended, each footfall a note on a scale, and opened the alley door into a garment of rain. Hey, she called over the steady curtain. You okay? The man turned. He had a face that seemed to have remembered how to be handsome after forgetting for a while. Lines at the corners of his eyes, the suggestion of an old worry cut along one brow, dark hair stubbornly curling at his temples despite the wet. He wore a work jacket the blue of late dusk, reflective tape along one sleeve. A coil of cable hung from his shoulder. Better now, he said, and to Leela's surprise, she recognized the voice. Eek, you must be Leela. She should have been startled, maybe. But the rain made thoughts feel like fish, bright, quick, and hard to catch. You're real, she said, and laughed at herself. Of course you're real. Do you work with the city? Sometimes, he said. Tonight I'm with your rooftop. Your bleeding signal every time lightning gets close. I've been listening to you talk around it for days. He lifted a plastic case, tapped it, brought a new arrestor, and a better ground strap. Ought to keep the charge from running down into your boards. Thunder lined up a distant reply, deeper than before. Leela should have fetched Harold. She should have checked credentials, made a call. The station had rules and sign-in sheets and laminated lanyards for crew. But the rain pared the world to essentials. Here is water. Here is light. Here is a problem. Here is someone who can fix it. And here was something else, also essential and hard to name. Something that rustled when he looked up at the roof and then back at her. Not a spark, because sparks are quick and die. A slow current, a tide under the tide. I can let you in, she said. The stair is this way. Inside, the stairwell amplified the storm like a cathedral makes whispers grand. Their steps shared a rhythm. At the second landing, the bulb flickered, as if in sympathy with the streetlight outside. He tested the handle of the roof door, nodded at the give. How long have you been running Midnight Harbor? He asked. 3 years, Leela said. 4, if you count the months I did it as a pirate stream from my apartment, with a lamp clipped to a coat rack. He grinned. Lightning lit the metal door for a breath, the grin becoming a brief negative on a film strip. I used to listen then, he said. You told a story about a bakery that only opened when it rained. People would line up with their umbrellas like colorful birds. Leela blinked. You remember that? I remember the smell you described, he said. Warm sugar, steam rising off coats. There are moments when a building breathes, when a stranger says a sentence that unlatches something inside your chest, and the hallway seems wider, the stair shallower, the storm warmer. Leela felt it then. The rain sharpened on the roof like 1,000 fingernails drumming approval. On the roof, the city opened like a dark flower. The harbor cranes stood like patient animals, their backs beaded with silver. Farther out, ships made gentle lanterns of themselves, bobbing. Lightning wrote its brief, illegible letters across the cloud belly. Thunder translated a second later into a language made of distance. E shook water from his hair, knelt by the antenna mast, and set the plastic case down. Tell me if you lose the signal, he said. Leela pressed her headphones to her ears. The studio below whispered through the wireless pack at her belt. Her own voice coming back from a minute ago, a loop in time. She spoke. Midnight Harbor is currently on the roof with a technician who may also be a memory. Her statement flew away down the wire and came back to her a heartbeat later. A small miracle. Still here, she told E. He worked quickly and without show. Unspooling the new ground strap, bolting it to the mast, checking the continuity with a small, patient meter. He looked like a man who had taught himself to fix things because parts of his life refused to stay together, and he refused to accept that. Lightning flashed, and he never flinched. Leela watched rain braid itself in his eyelashes. She didn't ask him what he stood for. Some letters are more beautiful without their full names. Try again, he said. Talk to them. Leela took a breath, tasted iron in the air. Friends, she said into the night. We are still together. The rain is heavier now. Thunder is nearer. The city is listening, and I am listening back. If you are awake, if you are alone, know that we are under the same storm. That must count for something. From the headphones came a reply so gentle she almost missed it. The soft applause of clean signal, the absence of grit. E's meter bobbed and relaxed, satisfied. There, he said quietly, you're grounded. The word warmed the space between them, as if spoken into cupped hands. Leela nodded, throat tight for a reason that had nothing to do with humidity. Thank you, she said. Do you have to go straight away? He glanced over the edge at the alley, now a brighter ribbon running toward the river. I should log the work at the substation, he said, but not in the voice of a man eager to leave. I'll walk you back down. They descended. In the short corridor before Studio B, the walls were hung with black and white photographs from the station's first years. A woman blowing a kiss to a microphone, a jazz trio crammed into a room the size of a pantry. A winter shot of kids with their ears pressed to big wooden radios, coats steaming on pegs behind them. Leela loved these pictures because they proved something she believed fiercely, that even in storms, especially in storms, people gathered around voices. At the studio door, E paused. I'll call in the work order from downstairs, he said. Harold likes his forms. You know Harold, Leela said, half statement, half question. Everyone knows Harold, he said, and that was not untrue. Then he surprised himself and her with the smallest confession. I like your show, he said, almost apologetic. Even the way you say the word rain, you don't just report it, you invite it in. The room seemed brighter for a fraction. Maybe the rain invites us in, Leela said. Thunder rumbled, as if agreeing, but more softly now, like furniture being put back where it belonged. He lifted a hand, unsure whether it wanted to be wave or touch, and let it be a wave. Good night, Leela. Good night. E back at the board. She slid the fader up and let the city into her lungs again. Friends, she said, voice steady, heart not. Tonight, the signal returned. When lightning came close, we didn't go dark. We found someone who knows what to do with light and with ground. And now we are here, all of us, beneath a generous sky. She read a short poem about umbrellas, played a record that sounded like rain even in drought, and took 2 more calls, a baker who promised to put cinnamon in the morning buns if the storm kept her up past 3, and a ferry captain who said the harbor had never smelled so clean. Each time she glanced up at the window, she saw the rain doing its endless work of translating the sky to the street. Each time thunder answered, it sounded a little more like a heartbeat. At 12:59, she closed. Sleep well, she told the city. If you wake, listen to the rain. It will say your name like a lullaby, over and over, until morning lets you go. She turned off the sign and sat in the softening dark, hands wrapped around the cooling mug, letting silence seethe and settle the way a pot does after boil. The notebook lay open at her elbow, a blank page waiting for chapter 2. Downstairs, a door closed, and she thought she heard, or imagined she heard, a voice in the stairwell say, "Until tomorrow." The storm loosened a little. The rain did not stop, of course, it did not stop. In this story, it never stops. But it shifted to a kind of whisper, as if nestling closer to the eaves to listen for what would happen next. Would she see him again? Would the signal hold? Would the city keep its bones? Out in the harbor, lightning stitched one last thin thread, quick and fine as the curve at the end of a letter, an unfinished flourish. Leela pressed her palm to the glass and made a quiet promise to the rain. "I will keep telling the story as long as you keep falling." And the rain, polite as always, answered by falling. Dawn did not so much arrive as brighten the rain. The storm wore a paler robe, that was all. Harbor City blinked awake beneath a pewter sky, and every gutter spoke in fluent water, while lightning practiced modest, far-off signatures, and thunder rolled itself into a quieter purr. Like a big cat settling, Leela slept lightly and briefly, as she always did after a good show, dreams slipping in and out through the cracks in thunder. When she rose, the world beyond her apartment window looked like a photograph behind foggy glass. Cranes softened, roofs smudged, the river a sheet of gray silk being shaken by an invisible hand. She boiled water and stood barefoot on cool tile, listening to a steady patter on the tin awning, and feeling, in some small hidden part of herself, that something had tilted overnight, not enough to spill anything, just enough to notice. On the table lay her spiral notebook, swollen with its own humidity. She flipped to last night's page. In the margin, she had written a single letter. Eek. Below it, in a different, lighter line, she had drawn a small square, an old habit from childhood, a token door she could open later if she wanted the memory to visit again. The rain tapped encouragement on the window. She smiled in spite of herself, then rolled the page forward to clean paper and wrote, "Love does not always arrive like sunshine. Often it comes like rain, the kind that makes you step closer to share an umbrella you didn't think you needed." The kettle began to mutter. Outside, somewhere down on the street, a delivery truck splashed to a stop, and a man laughed. The sound instantly softened by the curtain of water. Harbor City was always itself in the rain, generous with small noises, unwilling to be hurried, quietly loyal to those who woke early. Leela took her coffee to the window and watched the alley beside the bakery become its own earnest tributary again. The bakery's side door cracked open. Myra, flower on her sleeve, hair tied in a scarf, patterned with lemons, propped it with a bucket, and surveyed the small stream as if deciding whether to name it. Myra looked upward then, as she often did, toward the black rectangles of the radio station's windows. Seeing Leela at her apartment's window above, she raised the bucket in salute. Leela raised her mug. They were both in the sort of professions that people thanked by name only after midnight or only at dawn. She dressed in jeans and a sweater the color of wet bark, pulled on her honest yellow raincoat, and took the long way to the station. The long way on a rainy morning was the best way. Past the newsstand with its plastic cover snapping, past the ferry terminal where a handful of commuters, hoods up, umbrellas down, stood like punctuation, marks waiting to be placed in a sentence. On Pier 3, a boy threw bread to gulls and discovered the gulls didn't want bread today, only the performance of hunger. Lightning stitched a skinny vein along a cloud seam, and thunder mumbled approval a few seconds later, as if agreeing to disagree. At the station, Harold was already at his desk behind a topography of paper. He had the look of a man who had argued with an invoice and won decisively. His gray hair stood up in damp ridges, as though he too had spent time on the roof during some earlier storm. He peered at Leela over his glasses. "Signal held," he said without greeting, which was his way of offering one. Whoever that night electrician was knows their grounding. The arrester's brand new, and the strap is the fancy braid. "You okay with strangers on the roof?" "Not a stranger," Leela said before she could help it. "A listener." Harold snorted in a way that could be cynicism or affection, depending on the humidity. "The best kind," he conceded. He pushed across a clipboard. "There's a note. Came in under the door. No envelope." The clipboard held a single torn page from a pocket notebook, lined, softened, written in pencil. The handwriting was careful, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned to make himself understood to machines, and therefore took pains with people. It said, "You're good on the ground now. Stronger in storms. If it hisses again, it'll be the city, not the wire." E under the dash, very small, an initial like a bracket turned on its side. Leela felt the door she'd drawn in her own notebook swing inward and admit a draft of warm rain. "Make sure he logs his hours," Harold added, as if addressing the note. "People who fix things in storms sometimes forget to get paid for it." "I'll tell him," Leela said, and tucked the page like a talisman behind the plastic of her own clipboard, where she kept PSAs about library closures and ferry delays, and the weekly poem she chose as a bridge between songs. Studio B smelled of coffee and warmed dust, and the faint thrum of electricity moving through boards. She sank into the chair and let the familiar plane of the control board settle beneath her palms. The little green leads were outnumbered by the gray morning, and yet braver for it. She checked the recordings, trimmed the silence at the end. She had told herself she would not scan the call logs for a number she didn't know, and she did not. She simply let her eyes pass over them in a way that made it feel like looking and not looking at once. When she was done with the breakfast tasks, cutting a quick promo for the afternoon show, choosing the night's first record, Rain, on drumhead. A low saxophone, like walking home. She pulled up the studio blinds a fraction. The city outside had achieved a steady state soaking. Rain pulsed in chains from the roof edges, 1,000 beaded necklaces. Across the street, a woman in a red coat walked with her coat open, welcoming the water like a friend who had been away too long. Around noon, the ferry captain from the night before appeared in the doorway, holding a paper bag that breathed cinnamon. "Baker sent these up," he said. "She says, if you keep people company at midnight, you deserve sugar at noon." "Tell her she's part of the company," Leela said, accepting the bag. The captain, Nico, took off his cap and brushed rain from the brim. He was one of those men whose eyes were always in conversation with a distance that only he could see. "You sounded lighter," he said, as though listening were an orthopedist's examination. "The signal, I mean, like a window opened." "We fixed the ground," Leela said, then felt the little inward blush of how much more that meant now. A listener helped. Nico nodded like a man who knew the tides that brought people into one another's harbors. "Storms introduce us to the right strangers," he said simply, and left her with sugar and a sentence worth writing down. By late afternoon, the clouds rearranged themselves into a darker parliament. The gutters spoke with more insistence. Lightning began to abandon modesty and returned to grand gestures, writing the sky with a steady hand. Radio had always been a companion to weather. Tonight, it would have to be a confidant. Leela brewed tea in the station kitchenette and found herself staring at the microwave display while it counted down 2:59, 2:58. If practicing for midnight, she stopped the numbers at 2:56 because they made her feel as if time were being microwaved, and she didn't want it overdone. She opened her notebook. The chapter needed a shape. Stories about falling in love in the rain had tempted every writer since roofs were invented. What made this one true would be the exact sound the water made against the specific window in Studio B, and the way a particular man had said the word bones about the sky, and how she, Leela of the late night, was suddenly aware of walking through the city, not as a single person, but as the listener of a great, weathered heart. She wrote, "He fixed the wire, but what he really repaired was the part of me that had been bracing for interruption." When midnight came again, it arrived the way thunder sometimes does quietly, and then, all at once, the ON air light paired its low ember with the electric white of a near strike that turned the window into a mirror. And Leela saw herself briefly as the storm saw her. Small, luminous, intent. "Hello, friends," she began again, letting the words do their good work. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." She spoke about small certainties, the smell of cinnamon on a wet noon, the way the ferry's horn sounded friendly instead of lonely when the fog was thick, the miracle of a signal made stronger precisely when lightning tried to undo it. She did not say E's name, which was not a name, though she felt it like a quiet syllable held in the mouth. The phone light blinked. Line 1. She lifted the fader. The line hissed, then steadied, and the voice that arrived had learned to smile without moving its lips. Midnight Harbor. Welcome, Leela said. You're here. A pause. Rain embroidered the edge of the eaves. I'm here, he said. Up on the ridge above the substation, where the grass pretends it's not a lake. Thought I'd listen from high ground tonight. How does the storm sound from there? Like it's older, he said. Like it remembers more than we do. Leela leaned toward the microphone, the small circle that became a doorway at midnight. Tell me one thing it remembers. Another pause, and then, once, years ago, I was on a different roof, and I saw lightning choose a weather vane that looked like a running horse. For a breath, it was the fastest thing on earth. It was foolish, perhaps, to feel what she felt then, something like a small, bright boat setting off across a river between close banks. But foolishness is a vital vitamin in storms. Thank you, she said. And she did not mean for the image only. Calls came like slow rain. A night nurse on break in a lobby that smelled of lemon and antiseptic. A violin maker awake to hear if his shop's roof was stubborn or kind. A boy whispering from beneath a blanket fort and asking if thunder could hear him think. Leela answered everyone with the same attention she gave to thunder, which is to say, she listened first and trusted herself second. At 12:31, line 2 blinked with the clumsy insistence of someone unused to calling in. Leela opened it. Midnight Harbor, she said, and was met not by a voice, but by whether a rush of rain so near the phone it sounded like a celebration. Sorry, a breathless voice said. First time calling. I'm in a taxi, and the driver says, if I hold the phone any closer it might drown. Let the taxi breathe, Leela advised, smiling. What made you call? It's silly, the caller said, but I've been listening for 2 years and never pictured you with a yellow raincoat until today. I saw someone come out of the station this afternoon in a yellow raincoat, and I thought, that must be the one who talks to us like we're plants that need watering. Leela glanced at her coat on the back of the chair, dripping on a folded copy of the Harbor Times. She looked at the window, where lightning drew a line and thunder signed it. Guilty, she said lightly, and thank you for watering us back. When he called again later, his voice had moved closer to her voice, by weather, by intention, by whatever sense of distance phones sometimes choose. If you're not on the roof when you talk about it, he said, you make people feel like they are. Some nights, Leela said, I think the city climbs up through the downspouts to listen. Do you ever feel that? I fix the downspouts, he said, and she could hear the smile folded into his tone. So I hope not. But yes, tonight, I feel it. There are rooms where the air changes quietly when 2 people start telling the same story at the same time. Studio B did that then. The storm heard it and pressed its ear harder to the windows. Somewhere, Nico's ferry nudged a dock with a gentleness that surprised itself. Myra checked the oven and discovered a tray of buns as perfect as a good sentence. At 12:52, lightning struck close enough that the ON air sign hiccuped, blinked twice, and then returned to its red. Leela's meters budged and steadied. E drew a breath on the other end that had the quality of a laugh. "Ground's good," he said. "Ground's good," Leela echoed, and understood that the phrase had found another life. She closed the hour with a story about a city where people tied messages to the handles of umbrellas and left them at the doorways of those they loved, so that every storm brought new reading. As the record spun its last slow turn, she lifted the needle and looked at the photograph of the old trio on the wall. The bassist's eyes closed, the drummer's half-smile, the saxophonist's concentration holding a room together. And she thought of E next to a substation where water thought it was grass, listening to thunder remember. When the light dimmed, she sat again in the soft, retreating silence and read the pencil note once more. Stronger in storms. She put it back carefully and let herself say his letter out loud, just the one, into an empty room. It sounded like a beginning, or the right middle. Outside, the rain did its honest work without complaint. On Graymarket Street, puddles admitted small moons. On the river, barges dreamed they were whales. On rooftops, a million fingers tapped, tapped, tapped. A patient rehearsal for the future. The third night carried a different weight. The rain, though constant, had changed its handwriting. Drops struck the glass more slowly, deliberate, as though composing letters meant only for those awake enough to hear them. Lightning still traced wide loops across the cloud belly, but the pauses between thunderclaps lengthened, like the story was allowing room for thought. Leela arrived early, long before the ON air light glowed. Studio B was quiet, except for the deep sigh of the building, settling into dampness. She set down her mug, brushed water from her raincoat sleeve, and sat cross-legged on the chair, flipping open her notebook. The first 2 chapters of this new whatever it was story, beginning, coincidence, electricity, disguised as weather, had filled more pages than she expected. Outside the studio window, Graymarket Street reflected the city back at itself in broken pieces, neon splintered in puddles, street lamps shimmered like melted moons. Across the way, the bakery's exhaust vent sent out ghost breath clouds of sweet air. Myra had taped a hand-lettered sign to her door earlier. Storm special, cinnamon rolls, half price until the thunder stops. Leela doubted the thunder would stop. She doubted Myra minded. She skimmed the pencil note again, the one he had left, stronger in storms. It had sat behind her clipboard all day, like a whisper she could almost hear, pulling her back to last night's rooftop. Back to the moment she saw rain sliding down his eyelashes, and the way his voice sounded closer than it should have over the phone line. She found herself wondering if he would call tonight. And if he didn't, would she want him to? The question unsettled her, not like fear, but like realizing there's a melody threading through a song you've heard 1,000 times and never noticed until now. At 11:43, she made tea in the kitchenette. The station was nearly silent this time of night. Only the weather desk hummed faintly in the far wing, its lonely printer whispering out warnings about wind speeds near the river docks. On her way back, she stopped by Studio A, where a single trumpet solo from a late-night jazz track curled like smoke. She stood in the doorway, let herself breathe to its rhythm, and thought of E up on some ridge near the substation, listening to rain comb the grass into ripples. Back in her studio, the call board blinked once and went dark again. She hadn't even gone live yet. A test signal, maybe. Or, at 11:58, thunder rolled so close it shook the blinds. She laughed quietly, set her headphones on, and pressed the mic fader up, her voice threading into a city full of sleepless hearts. "Hello, friends," she began softly, the ritual anchoring her more than she'd admit. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." Tonight, she didn't plan the first half hour. She let the storm write it for her. The microphone caught the soft hiss of rain on the roof, the faint tick of drops against the glass, the distant bass of a foghorn beyond the docks. Leela spoke about bridges, the ones people cross without realizing, the ones the city built between strangers, the quiet connection when you and someone else hear the same thunderclap and think, "I'll remember this exact sound forever." At 12:09, line 1 lit. A tiny pulse of green in the dim room. She pressed the button and tried to sound steady. "Midnight Harbor," she said. "Hi." His voice was quieter tonight, almost as if testing the weight of silence before filling it. "I thought I'd listen from the bridge." She leaned toward the mic. "Which bridge?" "The big one over the inlet. Best view of lightning when it forks near the cranes." He paused, and she could hear rain kissing pavement on his end, muffled like applause through a coat. "I was fixing a relay there earlier. Thought I'd stay." The map of Harbor City unfolded instantly in her mind. She knew that bridge, the one where freighters groaned beneath like restless whales. The idea of him standing there now, under cold steel cables humming with storm-slick tension, sent a current along her arms. "You sound different," she said without meaning to. "So do you," he replied, "like you're closer to the mic, or maybe closer to something else." She swallowed. The studio smelled faintly of ozone, like lightning had brushed its fingertips against the station roof again. "Are you calling as a technician?" she asked softly. "Or as a listener?" A low chuckle, warm even through static. "Both, maybe." "Is that allowed?" "Allowed," she said, encouraged. Other calls wove through the hour like rivulets around stones. A poet in the East Wharf district read 3 lines she had just written about wet fire escapes glimmering under streetlight halos. A dockworker phoned to complain that gulls screamed louder than thunder. A child called from a blanket fort again, whispering just to say goodnight to the storm. But between every voice, every song, every soft breath of silence, Leela found her attention returning to line 1, to the bridge above the inlet, where lightning stitched its bright loops, and someone stood steady among cables strung like harp strings. At 12:37, while she cued a record, E's voice returned without her asking. "You ever notice," he said, "how thunder sounds different depending on where you are?" She turned down the monitor and leaned close. "Explain." "When I was standing by the substation last night, it rolled low, like a bass line under everything. Tonight, on the bridge, it breaks sharper, faster, like the skies striking steel instead of earth. A pause feels like the storm remembers different things from here." She smiled into the dark. "I like the idea of storms having memories." "They do," he said simply, and somewhere beneath them, the inlet waves slapped against stone like someone nodding in agreement. At 12:50, lightning struck close enough that both heard it at once. The snap, the blinding second of brightness, the rolling crash afterward. They stayed silent for the duration, letting the sound finish before speaking. When Leela finally found words, she whispered, "Same storm, same strike, same second." E answered, softer than rain, "And we're under it together." She ended the hour with a poem Myra had scribbled on a bakery receipt, her voice low and steady, the storm's breath still heavy outside. Love arrives not like sunlight, but like thunder across water, carrying distance and closeness in the same trembling sound. When the ON air light dimmed, Leela sat back, pulse thrumming to the slow percussion of drops on glass. Somewhere beyond the walls, a man in a blue work jacket stood on a bridge, the city's lights haloed in rain around him. She closed her notebook and knew instinctively that tonight was not an ending. It was the sound before the next thunderclap. By the fourth night, Harbor City had accepted the storm as a permanent guest. The clouds no longer hurried past. They lingered like old friends, with too many stories left to tell. The streets had become narrow rivers, reflecting trembling street lamps, and the gutters spoke in fast, bright syllables. Overhead, lightning wrote its unfinished script across the bruised sky, and thunder, patient as an archivist, stored every word. Leela arrived at the station earlier than usual, though she wasn't scheduled until midnight. Studio B felt like a sanctuary tonight, its faint hum of electronics steady against the weather's endless improvisation. She placed her damp yellow raincoat on the back of her chair, brushed stray droplets from her notebook, and traced last night's words with her fingertip. Same storm, same strike, same second. The sentence still carried the taste of something fragile, like a secret you haven't decided whether to keep or share. On the windowsill, the condensation gathered into long, slow tears. The glass vibrated faintly with each distant roll of thunder, and she imagined the whole city breathing through its architecture, bridges inhaling, rooftops exhaling, cranes bending like reeds against the sky. Harbor City had always felt alive to her, but lately Lately, it felt like it was listening. At 10:12 p.m., while the rest of the station was quiet, she wandered to the rooftop. The air smelled metallic, charged, like a live wire waiting for touch. Rain stitched diagonal lines across her vision, soft needles weaving sky into city, and the harbor lights below blurred into halos in the mist. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, letting drops run from her forehead to her chin. She thought of E, then of him on the bridge last night, his voice threaded with the memory of thunder striking steel. Did he know how carefully she'd been carrying his words? Did he know that in between calls, when she sipped tea and scribbled notes, she heard his voice layered over the rain like another frequency beneath her own broadcast? The thought unsettled her, but she didn't turn from it. By the time she came back downstairs, Harold was finishing up a terse phone call in his office, his voice muffled but unmistakable. Something about scheduling, something about towers. He waved a distracted hand at her without looking up. She returned the gesture, smiled faintly, and slipped back into Studio B on the control board. The little green LEDs blinked like fireflies, steady, reassuring. She touched the ON air switch gently, as if promising not to betray it. There were no calls yet, but she could feel the city out there awake, restless, leaning into the night with her. She opened her notebook, hesitated, then wrote, "When the storm doesn't leave, you stop waiting for it to pass. You learn to live inside it instead." At 11:53, she brewed tea in the kitchenette. The kettle hissed like static on an untuned frequency through the hallway window. She saw the bakery lights still glowing across the street. Myra never closed early during storms. She said sleepless nights made people hungry. On the glass, the bakery's neon sign warped into a wavering halo by the sheet of rain running down it. Then her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. The ridge above the substations flooded tonight. I'll be listening from the marina. Better view of lightning there. She stared at the words for a moment, heat blooming beneath her skin despite the damp air. Without thinking, she typed back, "Stay dry." Then she hesitated, deleted it, and replaced it with, "Be safe." But she didn't send that either. She set the phone face down on the counter and listened to the kettle finish its song. At midnight, Studio B glowed softly, a single room holding its breath against the storm's roar. She slid her headphones on, pressed the fader up, and let her voice enter the city again. "Hello, friends," she whispered, soft as the hush before thunder. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds. Fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." She let the silence after linger. Sometimes, the most important thing she gave the city wasn't her voice, but the space between sentences, where listeners could find themselves. Calls came slowly tonight, as if the weather demanded reverence. First, an elderly woman from the North Pier called to describe the lightning reflected in her window, saying it looked like angels writing with broken quills. A night janitor at the public library phoned in, reading a fragment of poetry he found tucked into a returned book. Every drop belongs to a cloud, but every puddle belongs to us. Leela scribbled it into her notebook instantly, underlining it twice. At 12:16, line 1 lit up. She knew before answering who it was. Midnight Harbor, she said softly. Marina's loud tonight, he said. Every sail mast clinks like wind chimes. She smiled, resting her chin on one hand. I can hear the echo behind you. It sounds alive there. It is, he said. Feels like the whole dock's holding its breath between lightning strikes. She imagined him leaning against a post, droplets sliding from his jacket collar, eyes tracking where the water and sky blurred into each other. You should see it, he added after a pause. The way the city looks from here, it's different when you're this low to the water, closer to the reflection than the skyline. Describe it to me, she said without thinking. There was a brief silence, filled only by the soft hiss of rain over his line. Then, the water's black, but it carries the city in pieces. Neon, lamp halos, tiny smears of white from ship lights. Every ripple's like someone breathing beneath the surface. You ever get the feeling the storm's listening back? Her throat tightened around the answer. I do, she whispered. Every night. At 12:32, they fell into a quiet that wasn't awkward. He stayed on the line, even when other calls came and went. She told a story about a couple who tied handwritten notes to empty bottles and tossed them into the harbor each night, knowing the tide would bring them back. Between words, she heard E's low breath steady against the microphone, as if anchoring her there. At 12:51, lightning forked across the marina and struck something metal nearby. E cursed softly, surprised, then laughed, the sound warm, unguarded. You okay? She asked quickly. Better than okay, he said. I think the storm's trying to tell me something. She smiled without meaning to, her fingers hovering over the fader. Maybe it already did. When the show ended, she lingered in the studio longer than usual, hands resting flat on the control board. Outside, the storm swelled again, unrelenting. The glass reflected her face, pale against the blinking city lights. And for the first time, she wondered if her voice had found its own echo somewhere in Eeyore, if it was the other way around. On the street below, the gutters overflowed, carrying rainwater toward the harbor like veins, pulsing into a single heart. Somewhere beyond, in the shadows of masts and ropes, she imagined him still standing there, watching lightning touch the horizon, and for reasons she didn't yet want to name. The thought steadied her. The fifth night carried a strange electricity, different from the storms before it. The city still wore its coat of rain, heavy and shining. But something beneath the weather had shifted, like the quiet moment when a heart learns a new rhythm before the mind catches up. Leela stood at her apartment window long before sunset, watching Harbor City blur beneath the downpour. The streets below were thin rivers running between dark buildings, and every passing car left wake trails behind it. Lightning stitched bright veins into the charcoal clouds, and the thunder that followed felt deeper now, closer, as though the storm had moved into the city's chest. She traced the glass with her fingertip, following the trembling outlines of distant cranes. She had written 3 full pages in her notebook since dawn, and yet none of the words said what she wanted them to say. Each sentence began as a thought about the station, or the listeners, or the rain, and somehow ended with him. She didn't like giving the letter weight it hadn't asked for, but somehow it had claimed its place between her sentences, like a bookmark pressed too deep to remove. At 9:46 p.m., the rain turned harder, sharper, as though someone had tilted the sky's bucket too far. Leela grabbed her yellow raincoat and slipped outside early, deciding to walk the long path again. The harbor's air smelled of wet stone and faint salt. Even from several blocks away, she could hear the creak of ship masts and the dull thrum of water striking hollow hulls. On Pier 3, gulls circled close to the lamps, crying like restless sentinels. Somewhere behind her, Myra's bakery still glowed, warmth spilling onto the flooded street. A new sign taped to the window read, "Free coffee for insomniacs. Pay with stories." Leela smiled faintly, knowing Myra probably meant it. When she reached the station, the halls were quieter than ever. Even Harold, normally a grumble disguised as a man, wasn't in his office tonight. A half-empty mug sat cold on his desk, steam long gone. She wondered where he'd wandered off to, and whether the storm had claimed him too. Studio B was cool and dim, lit only by the tiny green constellations of the control board. Leela rested her fingertips on the smooth fader knobs and felt the soft vibration of current beneath. The signal was strong, humming confidently. Whatever E had done 2 nights ago on the roof, it was holding. She opened her notebook to a clean page, and without meaning to wrote, "Some voices sound like places, and some places stay with you even when they're only voices." She stared at the line, exhaled slowly, and underlined it twice. At 11:56, her phone buzzed. A single message: "Marina's still alive tonight. The wind's carrying the ship bells clean across the docks. Thought you'd want to know." She stared at the words for a full minute, as if reading them could somehow let her stand beside him, smelling the salt, hearing the chiming masts. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed. And the lightning. The reply came instantly. "It's close enough to count between breaths." She swallowed, felt her pulse align with those unspoken seconds, and slipped the phone into her pocket without responding. Midnight came like an exhale. The ON air light glowed its soft ember, and her voice poured back into the city once more. "Hello, friends," she whispered, soft as rain sliding down glass. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds. Fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." Her words drifted into hundreds of rooms, threading beneath umbrellas, slipping between harbor ropes, resting against windows where people leaned, listening. The city was hers at this hour, not because it belonged to her, but because they were holding it together. At 12:09, line 1 blinked. She didn't need to wonder. "Midnight Harbor," she said softly. "The wind's colder here," he murmured, his voice quieter tonight, weighted somehow. "Feels like the storm's changing its mind." She leaned closer to the mic, lowering her own voice to meet his. "Changing how?" "Like it wants to leave," he said, pausing to let a distant clang of steel pass over the line. "But it doesn't know where to go." For a moment, neither spoke. Rain filled the silence, steady, endless. "Where are you?" she asked finally. "Dock 7, he replied, standing between two freighters that look like sleeping giants. A soft laugh followed, warmer this time. "One of them's so old it creaks when the tide shifts, like it's telling me secrets." "You always make the city sound alive," she said quietly. He paused. "I think it is." At 12:27, another voice joined them. Line 2 lit up, and she opened it to find Myra laughing softly in the bakery across the street. "You two keep me awake," Myra teased gently. "Leela, I swear I see you turning into one of those lighthouse keepers. Except your lights, made of words." Leela flushed despite herself, glancing instinctively at the glass, where rain ran like nervous handwriting. "Just making sure the ships don't get lost," she murmured. E chuckled faintly in her headphones. "Good thing," he said. "Some of us aren't good at directions." By 12:40, the rain softened, falling like silk threads instead of needles. The harbor bells rang clearer, each note floating across the marina and reaching the studio mic faintly through E's open line. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. "I do," Leela whispered back. "Feels like the city's trying to hum us to sleep." She closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her chest. "Then we should listen." At 12:55, as she closed the final segment with a short poem about tidewater and distance, she glanced at the window one last time. A shadow moved beneath the street lamp, just beyond the puddles. Someone in a blue jacket paused on the opposite curb, hands in pockets, face tilted toward the station's glowing sign. Her pulse caught, sharp and sudden, but before she could lean forward for a clearer look, the figure turned and melted into the rain. When she ended the show, the city outside was hushed, except for the steady drip of water from the awning. She lingered by the window, notebook pressed against her chest, wondering if she had imagined the figure, or if E had stopped by to listen. Not through the wire this time, but through the storm itself, and for the first time since the rain began. She hoped tomorrow night would come quickly. By the 6th night, the storm had begun to feel eternal. The city no longer asked when it would end. It simply moved within it, breathing rain like oxygen. Street lamps trembled in halos of water, and every window seemed to blur into a mirror of someone else's dreams. The harbor cranes stood motionless beneath the slate-colored sky, their dripping steel spines glowing faintly in the fractured light. Leela sat on the edge of her bed, yellow raincoat draped over one knee. staring at the spiral notebook in her lap. 3 pages were filled, but tonight's opening still wouldn't come. She tapped her pen against the margin, listening to the muffled percussion of raindrops against the roof, and thought of yesterday's show, of Myra's laughter, Nico's quiet call from the ferry, the child whispering from his blanket fort, and always she hated that his voice lived now between her sentences, a frequency beneath the words, softer than static, but impossible to tune out. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, as though the city spoke through him. Tonight, she told herself, she wouldn't wait for his call. Tonight, she would just speak. At 9:12 p.m., Leela left the apartment early and walked the flooded streets toward the station. Graymarket Street had become a black river under the soft amber lamps, cars sending crescents of spray into the air. The rain had softened into velvet tonight, a steadier rhythm that hummed against the edges of umbrellas and jackets alike. Myra waved from the bakery window when Leela passed. A handwritten sign on the glass read, "The first lightning strike after midnight gets you free coffee." Leela smiled faintly, shaking her head, but Myra only raised her mug like a salute. Farther down, near Pier 3, the masts of small sailboats clinked faintly in the dark, their shadows swaying like restless ghosts. Somewhere beyond, thunder rolled low, the deep voice of a sky refusing to sleep. The station was unusually quiet. Harold's office light was off, his mug missing, papers stacked neatly for once. She walked the hall slowly, hearing the soft hum of power through the walls, and when she reached Studio B, she paused in the doorway. It felt different tonight. The tiny green LEDs blinked with an intensity she hadn't noticed before, like they were eager for her voice. The control board hummed under her fingertips, as though alive with the weather's energy. She sat down, flipped open her notebook, and finally wrote. There are nights when the storm isn't outside anymore. It comes in, sits quietly in the room, and waits for you to notice. At 11:57, her phone buzzed on the console. One new message. Up on the old ferry bridge tonight. Waters high, currents fast. Lightnings crawling along the cables. Her breath caught briefly, and before she could stop herself, she typed back, "Be careful." This time, she pressed send. His reply came seconds later. "Always. Listen close when I call." She stared at the message until the ON air light blinked softly, pulling her back to the moment. Midnight descended like a hush, settling over the city. She adjusted the headphones, leaned close to the microphone, and let her voice slip into the storm. "Hello, friends," she said softly, her breath steady despite the quick thrum of her pulse. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." Tonight, she began with a tale about lost letters, messages once written, then drowned in the harbor decades ago, washing up again years later, when tides shifted just right. She spoke of small paper boats floating between centuries, carrying secrets from strangers who never met, and how storms seemed to remember what we forget. At 12:08, line 1 lit green. Midnight Harbor, she said softly, fingers grazing the fader. Lightnings close, he murmured, his voice threaded with wind and rain. Every strike turns the river silver. Are you safe? She asked before she could catch herself. He hesitated for half a second then. Safe enough. But the bridge feels alive tonight. The cables hum when the thunder rolls. She closed her eyes, picturing him there, the blue jacket darkened with rain, hands resting on the cold railing, the storm curling around him like a living thing. What does it sound like? She asked. E took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, slower, as though listening as he described it. Like the city's whispering secrets through the metal, like if you lean close enough, you'll hear every story the rain ever kept. Leela swallowed hard, lowering her voice instinctively. Tell me one. For a moment, all she heard was static softened by water. Then, Dock 4, he said finally. 23 years ago, lightning hit an old fishing boat there, split its mast like bone. Everyone thought the wreck was gone. But tonight I can smell burned wood on the wind, like the storms remembering it for me. A shiver ran through her. It's carrying memories, she whispered. Maybe it always does, he said. We just don't listen. Other calls came and went. The blanket fort child again, giggling sleepily. A security guard describing waves spilling over the pier. A pianist playing a melody too quiet for his own apartment walls, but between every voice, he stayed. He didn't fill the silence, didn't push it, he just stayed, breathing faintly on the line as though matching her rhythm. At 12:39, the storm struck hard, lightning spearing the sky, so close the glass above Studio B flashed white for an instant. Her monitors flickered, meters spiking, and she heard E's sharp inhale through the static. Still there, she whispered. Still here, he answered, voice steady despite the chaos around him, grounds holding. She smiled faintly, heart thudding against her ribs. Good, she said softly, but the word carried more weight than she meant it to. At 12:55, as the last record played, a low cello piece like raindrops falling through glass, Leela leaned back in her chair, eyes tracing the window's blurred edges. Outside, puddles glimmered with reflections of neon signs, trembling with each ripple of wind. And then she saw him. Across the street, beneath the pale halo of a street lamp, a figure in a dark blue jacket stood motionless, hands buried in pockets, gaze tilted up toward the station window. Her breath froze. But before she could move, lightning flashed again, blinding her for a heartbeat. When her vision cleared, the street was empty. She didn't mention it on air. Not yet, when the ON air light finally dimmed. She sat in the dark studio, notebook closed, listening to the rain speak its quiet language against the glass. She wondered if he had really been there, or if the storm had simply borrowed his shape for a moment, folding him into its endless memory, and for the first time since the rain began, She wasn't sure where the city ended and she began. By the seventh night, Harbor City seemed to exist entirely underwater. The clouds had dropped lower, pressing their damp weight against rooftops, while the rain refused to rest, falling in sheets so thick they blurred the skyline into watercolor shadows. The harbor cranes, the ferry docks, the crooked alleyways, everything trembled under the steady percussion of water. Thunder had grown quieter now, though not weaker. It rumbled from deeper places, like a sleeping beast shifting under the city's foundations. Lightning, however, had become bolder, sharp, electric strokes, sketching wild shapes across the bruised belly of the clouds. Leela woke before dusk and couldn't go back to sleep. Her apartment was dark, except for the faint reflection of city lights trembling in puddles below. The notebook lay open on her table, last night's words still visible. The storm carries memories, we just don't listen. She traced the line with her fingertip, restless. The rain had begun to feel personal somehow, as if it wasn't simply falling on the city, but falling for it, stitching together moments that belonged only to those awake enough to notice. And maybe, she thought, some people were meant to listen more closely than others. At 8:42 p.m., Leela wandered down Graymarket Street, letting the rain soak the cuffs of her jeans. Despite her yellow coat, the bakery window glowed warm across the street. Myra's laughter, faint even through the storm. A new sign sat crooked on the glass. Story swap at sunrise. Bring your best one. Leela smiled at the thought of strangers gathering in the damp dawn, trading secrets over steam and sugar. Harbor City had its own gravity in storms. People moved closer without realizing it. Near the harbor, she paused at the railing overlooking Dock 7. The water was restless tonight, black and restless, licking the stone edges like something alive. The lights of the marina blurred against its surface, fractured into shards by each passing ripple. She leaned against the cold metal rail and listened to the wind hum through the masts. Somewhere out there, she knew, E was listening too. When she reached the station, Harold's office light was finally on, but Harold himself wasn't inside. A damp coat hung from the back of his chair. A single half-drunk mug of coffee left steaming on the desk. There was a sense of movement without presence, as though everyone tonight was caught in some kind of quiet drift. Studio B, though, was steady, constant as a heartbeat. The hum of the control board soothed her, the small green LEDs winking back like a promise. She brushed water from her sleeves, slipped off her headphones to test their warmth, and wrote the first line of the night's script in her notebook. There are nights when the city stops talking and the rain begins to speak instead. She stared at the sentence, letting it settle, then closed the notebook. Tonight didn't need a plan. Tonight needed listening. At 11:54, her phone lit up with a new message. West Dock, top of the signal tower. Views unreal, call me. She hesitated, fingertips lingering above the keyboard, but typed only one word back. Okay, Midnight arrived like a held breath, finally exhaled. The ON air light bloomed red, soft and steady. She leaned close to the microphone, and her voice threaded into the dark like silk, slipping through water. "Hello, friends," she whispered, softer than ever. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." For the first few minutes, she didn't tell one. She let the storm speak instead, the microphone catching the distant hiss of water along the awning, the faint rattle of glass, the low hum of the city underneath it all. Listeners would hear it. She wanted them to. At 12:07, line 1 blinked green. "Midnight Harbor," she breathed. "Look up," he said quietly, his voice threaded with wind. She froze for half a second, heart catching. "Why?" "Because the lightning's crawling across the whole skyline," he murmured, all woven into the edges of his tone. "From here, you can see it stretch from the marina to the old ferry bridge, the towers shaking with it." She swiveled toward the studio window, pressing her palm to the cool glass. Lightning flashed, brilliant and white, illuminating the distant masts like skeletons in motion. The city glimmered beneath it, rain turning every street into a river of liquid light. "You're on the tower," she whispered. "Yeah," he said softly. 40 meters up. The cables hum like something alive. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine the sound in his ears, the way the storm must be vibrating through steel, through bone. "You can hear it," he added after a pause. "Can't you?" She frowned faintly, unsure. "Hear what?" The storm remembering itself. The words sank into her, deep and strange. At 12:21, another call came through. An old fisherman from Dock 3. He said the tides had shifted strangely, higher than he'd seen in 20 years. "Feels like the sea's breathing faster," he muttered. Leela scribbled his words down. She always did when something aligned with E's instincts. By 12:36, the storm grew louder, the wind curling down alleys and around rooftops. Lightning struck somewhere close. The monitors blinked white. The power dipped for a fraction, and then steadied again. "Ground's holding," E said on the line without waiting for her to ask. "I know," she whispered back. "You're there." Neither of them said more. The silence was weighted, but comfortable, the kind of quiet that only exists when someone else is breathing close, even from miles away. At 12:49, he spoke again, lower now, almost intimate. "Do you ever think," he said slowly, "that some storms aren't just weather? That maybe they come for a reason?" Her throat tightened. "To wash things clean, or to bring people where they're supposed to be," he said. Leela sat frozen, pen idle against paper, listening to the storm's endless hymn. When the hour ended, she closed with a line she hadn't planned, one that came unbidden as her voice softened into the microphone. "Tonight, the city is awake, but the rain remembers more than we do." As the ON air light dimmed, she sat in the stillness, headphones resting in her lap. Outside the studio window, the signal tower rose like a skeletal hand reaching into the sky. Lightning flashed once, brief and blinding, illuminating a tiny figure at its crest. A man in a dark blue jacket, steady against the wind. And this time, she knew she wasn't imagining him. By the 8th night, Harbor City no longer seemed to resist the storm. The rain had become its pulse, steady and unbroken, falling with the patience of something eternal. The streets glimmered under fractured reflections, the neon signs bleeding into the puddles, and every rooftop carried its private percussion. The entire city moved in time with the weather now, as though every drop of water had joined some silent rhythm that only a few people could hear. Leela woke before sunset again, tangled in thin sheets, the windows fogged with breath and rain. She lay still for a long time, listening to the quiet inside her apartment and the unbroken hiss outside, and realized there was no longer any separation between them. The storm was inside now, following her heartbeat. Her notebook rested open on the table where she'd left it. Last night's final line, underlined twice. The rain remembers more than we do. She traced the words with her fingertip each time she reread them. They felt less like something she'd written, and more like something the city had whispered through her. She wondered if he felt it too. At 9:25 p.m., she walked toward the station, rain soaking the cuffs of her jeans despite her yellow coat. Graymarket Street gleamed in watery lamplight, each puddle reflecting a warped slice of Harbor City's night. Myra's bakery window glowed as always, and tonight's sign leaned slightly askew in the glass. Half-price croissants, if you can name the sound thunder makes in your dreams. Leela smiled faintly, shaking her head, but made a mental note to ask Myra later what answers she'd collected so far. Farther down, near Pier 7, she paused to watch the ships rocking against their moorings. The ropes creaked faintly, masts humming with wind, and lightning flashed far out beyond the inlet, carving jagged scars across the clouds. The storm felt heavier tonight, thicker, as though the sky was holding its breath for something it hadn't decided whether to release. When she reached the station, Harold's office door was closed, but muffled voices spilled out, low, urgent. She hesitated, catching fragments of words she couldn't place. Signals unstable again. Voltage spikes near the marina. He was on the tower last night, wasn't he? Her stomach tightened at that last one. She stepped back quietly, letting the hallway swallow the sound, and slipped into Studio B without knocking. Inside, the control board waited like a patient instrument, LEDs blinking soft green under her fingertips. She tested the signal solid, clean, unwavering. Whatever Harold worried about, the boards didn't share his concern. Leela flipped open her notebook and wrote, "Some nights, the city speaks in voices too low for anyone else to hear." Then, almost without thinking, she added a second line beneath it, "And sometimes someone answers." At 11:52, her phone buzzed against the console. North Jetty, waters wild tonight. Feels like the whole dock's moving. E, she typed back quickly this time, without hesitation. Stay away from the edge. A moment later, the reply came. I always do. But listen when I call. There's something strange tonight. She stared at the message until the ON air sign warmed red, pulling her back. Midnight came quietly, almost reverently, as though even the storm paused to listen. She leaned close to the microphone, lowering her voice so that the rain itself could hear her. Hello, friends, she said softly, her breath steady but heart unsteady. This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds. Fall asleep to the sound of rain and listen to a wonderful bedtime story. For the first few minutes, she let the city speak instead, the microphone catching distant drips from the awning, the soft rustle of water against the glass, the deep echo of thunder rolling somewhere beyond the harbor cranes. At 12:06, line 1 blinked. Midnight Harbor, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can feel it, he murmured, wind and rain tangled in his words. The storm's different. She frowned slightly, lowering her voice instinctively. Different how? It's heavier, he said softly, like the air's holding electricity in its lungs. Lightning's striking farther out, but you can hear the delay between thunderclaps stretch longer and longer. It feels like the city's between heartbeats right now. Leela shivered despite the studio's warmth. Where are you? North Jetty, he answered. The waves are higher than they should be. They slam against the rocks like they're trying to climb back into the sky. She imagined him there, the blue jacket darkened to black in the rain, droplets sliding down his jaw, his voice low, as though speaking directly to her instead of into the wire. She began, but stopped. Yeah, be careful. I am, he said softly. But listen, Leela, you need to stay on the line tonight. Her hand froze on the fader. Why? Just trust me. At 12:18, a second call arrived unexpectedly on line 2. It was Nico, the ferry captain. His voice carried a strange tension beneath its usual calm. Leela, he said quietly, the tide's risen almost half a meter in the last hour. That doesn't happen here. Not like this. Before she could respond, E's voice cut in on line 1. He's right. I'm watching it now. The waves are climbing the dock stairs like they're breathing. It's not normal. The storm roared louder outside, as though punctuating his words. At 12:33, lightning split the harbor sky, illuminating the entire marina in an explosion of silver-white light. Leela flinched, pressing a hand to the glass instinctively. When her vision cleared, she saw something strange. The reflections in the water moved slower than the city above, lagging by a heartbeat. She whispered, you're seeing this too, aren't you? A pause, then his voice, steady but hushed. Yeah, it's like the waters on a different time. The thought landed heavy between them, unspoken but undeniable. Something is happening tonight. At 12:47, the storm calmed suddenly, unnaturally, as though someone had closed a door on its sound. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, wrong. She said carefully, what's happening where you are? He didn't answer immediately, then low and almost reverent. "The harbor lights just went out." Her throat tightened. All of them, he whispered. "Leela, stay on the air." At 12:59, just before the show closed, thunder rolled again, deeper than before, like the earth itself shifting under the city's weight. The studio lights flickered once and steadied, and in that brief blink of darkness, Leela thought she saw a silhouette move outside the glass. Someone watching. But when she turned, the street below was empty. She ended the hour softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Some nights, the rain carries more than water. Sometimes it carries warnings." And as she hung up her headphones, she knew with unshakable certainty, tomorrow night, everything would change. By the 9th night, Harbor City was holding its breath. The storm hadn't stopped, but it had changed. The rain still fell, relentless and soft, yet the rhythm was wrong somehow, irregular, as if the clouds were hesitating. Thunder no longer rolled with its deep, patient voice. It came in sharp, sudden bursts, like warnings shouted from somewhere far away. Leela woke long before dusk and sat at her window, staring at the silver-gray blur of the city beyond. The harbor's lights reflected in distorted fragments across the restless water, breaking and rejoining like thoughts she couldn't hold. For the first time since the rain began, she felt the weight of silence beneath the sound. Her notebook lay open beside her. On the last page, circled 3 times, were last night's words. "Some nights, the rain carries more than water. Sometimes it carries warnings." She ran her fingertip over the ink until it smudged faintly. Warnings of what? At 8:47 p.m., Graymarket Street was deserted. Even the bakery's windows were dark tonight. No soft yellow glow. No warm laughter spilling out into the rain. A handwritten note taped to the glass reed. "Closed early. The sea's breathing strange." Myra Leela stood there for a long moment, rain gathering at the edge of her hood, reading the same 5 words over and over. The sea's breathing strange. By the time she reached the harbor, the storm had stilled unnaturally. The masts of the smaller sailboats stood rigid against a sky that looked carved from slate, and the ropes hung stiff, unmoving. The water, however, rippled in slow, deliberate circles, as though something beneath the surface was shifting, unsettling the entire inlet. She found herself whispering into the damp air, as though the city might answer, "What are you trying to tell us?" When she arrived at the station, Harold was waiting outside Studio B, arms crossed tightly over his chest, brows drawn low. His gray hair was plastered to his forehead, rain dripping onto his glasses. "You feel it too, don't you?" he said without preamble. "Feel what?" she asked, breath shallow. "The pressure," he murmured, "like the air's gone heavy. The engineers checked the transmitters earlier, the rooftop antennas pulling more current than it should. Something's feeding into it." Leela frowned, heart climbing into her throat. "From where?" Harold shook his head slowly. "That's the problem. We don't know." Before she could reply, The lights flickered once and steadied, the studio humming softly around them. He glanced toward the ceiling, lips pressed thin, and muttered, "Stay live tonight, Quinn. If anything happens, I want this signal running." At 11:51, her phone buzzed. "Outer seawall. You won't believe this." Her hands tightened around the phone. She typed quickly, "What's wrong?" The reply came seconds later. "The water's pulling away from the rocks, like it's breathing in." Her chest went cold. She wanted to tell him to leave, to come back to the station where it was safe. But the words refused to form. Instead, she typed, "Call me the second it changes." "Already on the line," he sent back. Midnight came like the pause between lightning and thunder, fragile and full of waiting. She slipped into her seat, adjusted her headphones, and pressed the fader up with deliberate care. "Hello, friends," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." She almost believed the steadiness of her tone, almost forgot the strange weight in the air, until line 1 lit up instantly, pulsing green like a heartbeat. "Midnight Harbor," she whispered, steadying her voice. "You need to hear this," he said, his words breaking slightly over wind. "The waves aren't hitting the rocks anymore. They're moving backward, the entire inlet's pulling away like the ocean's holding its breath." She stared at the studio window, rain crawling down the glass like nervous handwriting. "Is that even possible?" "Not naturally," he murmured. "I'm standing on the seawall. The water's exposing rocks I've never seen before. It's like the tides reversing." Her breath caught. "Leave the wall." "Not yet," he said quietly. "I need to know what's causing this." At 12:13, Nico, the ferry captain, called on line 2, his voice sharp and urgent. "Leela, listen carefully," he said. "I'm anchored half a mile out. The current's wrong, it's pulling against the wind. Feels like something big's moving under the harbor." Before she could answer, E's voice cut softly through her other ear. "He's right. The water's not behaving like water anymore. It's breathing in and out, slower than us, like it's alive." A tremor slid down her spine. Come back," she whispered again. "I can't," he said simply. "Not yet." At 12:28, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the entire marina in stark silver light. For one breathless moment, Leela saw something impossible. The reflections in the water weren't matching the city above. The towers shimmered out of sync, lagging behind reality by fractions of a second, like a mirror trying to catch up. She whispered, "Tell me you're seeing this too." "I am," he said softly, wind rushing against his mic. "It's like the water's remembering the city differently than we do." At 12:42, thunder rolled deep beneath their feet, not above them, vibrating through the ground and up into the studio floor. Leela's mug trembled against the console. In her headphones, she heard E's voice drop lower, tighter. "Something's coming." "From the water," she breathed. "No," he whispered. "From underneath it." At 12:53, the station's lights flickered violently, and for 3 full seconds, everything went black. The boards, the monitors, the ON air light all dead. And yet, somehow, through her headphones, the signal remained alive. Leela, E's voice came, steady and clear despite the outage. Don't stop talking. Keep the station awake. Her hand shook against the mic. Why? Because, he said softly, I don't think the storm's listening anymore. When the lights returned, the street outside the station was empty, but the puddles were rippling outward from nothing at all, as though something invisible had stepped through them. She closed the show with a line that wasn't in her notebook, wasn't planned, wasn't hers. Sometimes the water keeps secrets until the night it chooses to speak. And tonight, she thought, Harbor City had begun to listen back. By the 10th night, Harbor City no longer slept. It wasn't just the rain, it was the silence beneath it. The storm still fell endlessly, stitching water into every street and alley. But between each raindrop was something heavier, something that felt like waiting. The air pressed close, thick with static, and the neon signs along Graymarket Street flickered as though they, too, were holding their breath. Leela hadn't slept either. Her notebook lay open across the kitchen table, her tea untouched, the pages crowded with fragments of thoughts she couldn't finish. In the margin, over and over, she'd written the same words. It remembers. She didn't know whether she meant the storm, the water, or herself. At 8:37 p.m., she stood at the edge of Pier 6, hood pulled low, watching the harbor churn. The waves no longer moved like water. They rolled in long, slow pulls, almost deliberate, as though the sea itself had decided on a different rhythm. The reflections of the harbor, lights stretched unnaturally far, bending and warping like oil slicks across glass. Somewhere out on the dark line of the breakwater, a ship's bell rang faintly, but its echo sounded wrong, delayed, hollow, like it came back from a distance, farther than it should. Myra's bakery was dark again. A damp note was pinned to the door, tides rising, closed until morning. Leela read it twice before heading toward the station, boots splashing shallow puddles that seemed to ripple even after she passed. Harbor radio felt different tonight, not quieter, just tense, like the walls themselves were bracing against something unseen. Harold was pacing outside Studio B, sleeves rolled up, his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw her, he ended the call abruptly. They've picked up interference, he said without preamble. From the storm, she asked. Not exactly. He hesitated, lowering his voice. The engineers isolated a low-frequency signal under the main band. It's strong, stronger than anything we've seen in years. Her brow furrowed. From where? He shook his head, jaw tightening. That's the problem. It's coming from below the harbor. Leela felt her pulse quicken, but before she could ask more, Harold placed a hand on her shoulder. Stay live tonight. No matter what happens, don't cut the feed. At 11:47, her phone buzzed with a message. South Seawall. You need to see this. She hesitated, fingers trembling over the keyboard before typing. Tell me, a pause, then, lights under the water, moving. Leela stared at the words, heartbeat stuttering. Before she could reply, the second message arrived. I'll call when it starts again. Midnight arrived heavy, dense, full of electricity. She slipped on her headphones, pressed the fader up, and let her voice settle into the darkness. Hello, friends, she whispered, her words careful and soft. This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds. Fall asleep to the sound of rain and listen to a wonderful bedtime story. But tonight, her voice felt like a thread stretched across deep water. At 12:05, line 1 blinked. Midnight Harbor, she breathed. You're not going to believe this, he said, his voice lower than usual, edged with static. The lights are back. They're under the surface, moving like currents, but they're not reflections, Leela. They're glowing. She straightened in her chair, hand tightening around the mic. How many? I can't count them, he said softly. Dozens, maybe more. They're following the shape of the inlet, like they know where they're going. She swallowed hard, lowering her voice instinctively. What color? Pale blue, he whispered, like lightning trapped under glass. Her gaze drifted to the studio window, where rain streaked down the glass in restless lines. Listen to me. You need to come back. Not yet, he said. Something's calling them. At 12:16, Nico joined the line on line 2, his voice tight and fast. I'm anchored near Dock 8, the ferry captain said. The current's pulling toward the center of the harbor now, like the whole inlet's leaning forward. It's not natural, Leela. I've never seen anything like this. Before she could respond, murmured faintly, I hear it too. Hear what? She asked quickly. There was a pause, wind rushing against his mic. Then, very softly, a sound under the water. Low, deep, almost like breathing. At 12:29, lightning arced across the entire skyline, striking somewhere far beyond the harbor mouth. For a single blinding second, the rain froze midair, silver spears suspended in light. And then, faintly, through the microphone, Leela heard it too, a distant, low hum, so deep it made her chest vibrate. What is that? She whispered. E's reply came quieter than the storm. I think it's the source. At 12:37, the studio lights dimmed again. The control board shivered beneath her fingertips, the meters spiking and settling with each pulse of the low hum. Harold's voice crackled faintly over the intercom. Signal's clean, he said, but we're picking up that frequency again. Quinn, stay live. Keep feeding it back. Her throat felt dry, but she nodded anyway. Copy. At 12:46, E's voice returned, softer now, like he was leaning too close to something dangerous. Leela, he murmured, the lights are rising. Out of the water. Her chest tightened. What do you mean, rising? They're breaking the surface, he whispered, drifting upward, slow, like they're listening for something. A single raindrop slid down the studio window, tracing its way into a trembling reflection. She could almost imagine the pale blue lights beneath the harbor, lifting one by one, reaching for the storm above. At 12:55, she saw something outside the station, a figure in a dark blue jacket, standing at the corner beneath the street lamp, looking up at the studio window. Her breath hitched, but before she could move, the lightning flashed and the figure vanished. She closed the show softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Some nights, the city tells us its secrets, but tonight, I think the water found its voice. And as she set down her headphones, the hum still lingered faintly in the floor beneath her feet. By the 11th night, Harbor City felt like it had slipped somewhere between waking and sleep. The storm hadn't stopped, not once, not for a single breath, but the rain had softened into a steady curtain, as though the sky had resigned itself to silence, and yet the quiet was heavier than thunder had ever been. Every drop seemed to carry something unspoken, something listening. Leela hadn't slept at all. The low hum they'd heard last night, the one that vibrated in her chest long after the broadcast ended, was still inside her somehow. Like the ghost of a sound she couldn't shake, she sat at her kitchen table, tea cold, notebook open, staring at the pale blue lines of unfinished sentences. In the margin, she'd written it 3 times without realizing something is waking. At 8:54 p.m., the city streets felt wrong. The rain still fell, but the wind had vanished entirely, leaving the air thick and unmoving. Even the puddles seemed strange, still, glassy, holding perfect reflections of street lamps above. When she passed Myra's bakery, the lights were on again, but the sign in the window was new. Close the shutters. Watch the water. Myra Leela paused, fingertips brushing the damp glass. Through the window, Myra stood behind the counter, motionless, eyes fixed on something far away. When she noticed Leela, she only raised 2 fingers in greeting and mouthed silently, "Be careful." At 9:26 p.m., Leela reached the station and found Harold standing outside, cigarette burning low between his fingers. Though she'd never seen him smoke before, the glow illuminated the deep lines beneath his tired eyes. "They're saying it's seismic," he murmured without looking at her. "What is?" she asked, pulling her hood back. The readings under the harbor, constant vibrations. He flicked ash into the puddles, watching it dissolve instantly. Problem is, the oceanographers checked. There's no tectonic activity in the area, nothing to cause it. "So, if it's not the Earth," she whispered, "what is it?" Harold looked at her for the first time, his glasses streaked with rain, his jaw tight. "That's what scares me." Inside Studio B, the control board hummed faintly, a low current thrumming through its wires, as though it were waiting. She ran her fingers across the console, testing the signal. It was strong, flawless, almost unnaturally clean. Her notebook sat open beside the mic. She wrote, without meaning to, "The city dreams, and the water carries those dreams where we cannot follow." At 11:42, her phone buzzed violently against the console. A message from E. Signal tower. Top platform. You need to see this. Her fingers shook as she typed back. Tell me what you see. After a pause, his reply arrived, brief and sharp. Lights. Dozens. Moving inland. Midnight came like a held breath. She slid on her headphones, pressed the fader up, and whispered into the dark. Hello, friends, she said, voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds. Fall asleep to the sound of rain and listen to a wonderful bedtime story. But tonight, there would be no soft tale. Tonight, she needed the city awake. At 12:04, line 1 blinked. Midnight Harbor, she breathed. They're closer, he said immediately, wind roaring faintly through his mic. The lights from the water, they're moving toward the seawalls now, following the current inland as if they're being pulled. How many this time? Hundreds, he whispered, maybe more. It looks like a constellation under the surface. Leela leaned closer to the mic. What do they look like? Small, he said after a pause. Each one glows pale blue, but the light isn't fading, not in the rain, not in the waves. They feel alive. At 12:11, Nico's voice came in urgently on line 2, louder than usual. Leela, listen. I just pulled the ferry out farther into the inlet. The current's reversed again, and it's pulling everything toward the center. You need to get E off that tower now. Before she could respond, E's voice cut sharply through her headphones. Not yet, he said quickly. You need me here. The tower's shaking every time the lights move. The metal hums like it's resonating with them. Her knuckles whitened around the pen. E, come back. Silence. Only the storm in the background, distant, heavy, at 12:27. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the entire harbor in blinding white. For a fraction of a second, Leela saw them. Countless faint orbs rising beneath the waves, shifting as though in perfect formation. She inhaled sharply, almost forgetting the mic was live. E, she whispered, they're everywhere. I see them, he said, breathless. Leela, they're not drifting anymore. They're climbing up the pilings, onto the seawall. They're leaving the water. At 12:34, the studio lights flickered violently, every bulb trembling, the control board spiked, meters flashing red before plunging into darkness for 2 full seconds. When the lights returned, the low hum was louder, not in her headphones this time, but in the room itself, vibrating through the floor. Leela, E murmured through static. I can hear them. Hear what? She breathed. They are singing. At 12:46, the sound reached her too. Faint at first, barely there beneath the rain, but unmistakable, a deep, resonant tone, layered and complex, vibrating through glass, metal, and bone. It wasn't words, but it carried intention. Nico came back on the line, voice tight. Leela, it's coming from the harbor. The lights, the hum, they're in sync. It's like they're responding to something under us. At 12:55, as lightning tore across the sky again, Leela turned instinctively toward the studio window, and there, On the corner beneath the flickering street lamp stood the figure in the blue jacket. He wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't on the tower anymore. But his voice was still in her headphones. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she rose slowly from her chair. The figure outside tilted his head up, almost deliberately, as if aware of her gaze. And then, without a sound, he stepped backward into the darkness and vanished. In her ear, E's voice whispered, "Leela, stay inside." She closed the show with a line that came unbidden, carried on something older than words. The harbor is dreaming tonight, and we are waking inside its dream. When she set her headphones down, the hum hadn't stopped. It had grown louder. The 12th night arrived like the pause before a confession. The storm had not stopped, but it had changed again. The rain no longer simply fell, it whispered. Each drop struck the glass with a strange precision, as though carrying patterns only the harbor could understand. Lightning traced skeletal veins across the swollen sky, illuminating Harbor City in fleeting, ghostly moments, while thunder rolled low and steady, like a distant drum, summoning something closer. Leela sat in Studio B long before her shift, headphones resting around her neck, notebook open but untouched. Her pen lay still against the paper. She didn't need to write tonight. She felt it already. The hum they'd heard before wasn't faint anymore. It thrummed beneath her shoes, through the metal legs of the chair, through the console, into her chest. A sound without origin, without language, yet she understood instinctively something was coming. At 8:12 p.m., she walked down to the harbor. The streets were deserted, the bakery dark, Myra's windows shuttered tight against the rain. Even the gulls were silent, wings folded, perched along the rails like pale sentries. The water was wrong tonight, perfectly wrong. It moved in long, slow circles, spiraling inward toward the harbor's center, smooth and deliberate, like an enormous lung drawing its breath. The faint, pale blue lights from the previous night were back, but this time there were hundreds, thousands maybe, rising and sinking beneath the surface in patterns that looked almost mathematical, as if some great mind was sketching equations in motion under the waves. Her phone buzzed. One message. Top of the tower. You'll want to see this. E at 9:03 p.m. She climbed the metal stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding with each step. The storm wind tangled her hair, wet and cold against her cheeks, until she reached the platform. And there he was. E stood at the railing, dark blue jacket clinging damp to his shoulders, drops rolling down his jawline like glass beads. His face was turned toward the sea, pale blue light reflecting in his eyes. And for a moment, she thought he hadn't noticed her. Then, without turning, he said softly, "You hear it too now, don't you?" Leela froze. The hum, he nodded, still staring at the harbor. It's getting louder and closer. She stepped to the railing beside him, her breath hitching when she saw it. The lights beneath the surface, no longer drifting, they were aligning, spiraling toward the harbor's center in precise, concentric patterns. "They're organizing," she whispered. "Or waking up," he murmured. At 9:37 p.m., the first vibration hit. It wasn't thunder. It came from below. The steel under their feet trembled like a struck tuning fork, the railing humming beneath her palms. Out on the water, the blue lights pulsed once, twice, and then every single reflection of Harbor City on the waves shattered, gone, leaving nothing but blackness beneath the surface. He gripped the railing tighter. "It's starting." By 10:05 p.m., she was back in studio. Her headphones were on, mic armed, but she hadn't gone live yet. Outside the station window, the street lamps flickered wildly, their light spilling across empty streets and puddles that trembled despite the absence of wind. Harold appeared in the doorway, his voice unusually low. "The engineers traced the signal," he said. She turned slowly, holding her breath. "And," he hesitated, "it isn't interference, Quinn." "What then?" "It's an origin point," he whispered, leaning closer, directly beneath the harbor floor. At 11:58, her phone lit up with one more message from E. "Stay live, no matter what happens." She typed back quickly. "Where are you?" "Where I need to be," came the reply. Midnight struck like a blade sliding through water. She pressed the fader up, voice steady, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "Hello, friends," she said, softer than ever, her breath fogging the microphone's mesh. "This is another love story for bedtime. Get comfortable in your beds, fall asleep to the sound of rain, and listen to a wonderful bedtime story." But tonight, she wasn't speaking only to the city. She was speaking to the harbor, too. At 12:09, line 1 lit green. "Midnight Harbor," she whispered. "They're above the surface," he said, his voice quiet but sharp, cutting through static. "Leela, they're floating." She blinked, disbelieving. "What do you mean?" "The lights, dozens of them, rising out of the water like glass beads, hovering in the air. And there," he stopped abruptly, breath catching in her headphones. "They're listening." At 12:18, Nico broke through on line 2, voice shaking. "Leela, I can't hold the ferry steady anymore. The currents are pulling inward. I don't know what's in the middle, but it's strong enough to drag steel." Before she could answer, the hum swelled suddenly, loud enough to rattle the glass of the studio window, and then she heard something new beneath it. A pattern, 3 tones repeated. Low, lower, lowest. Over and over, syncing perfectly with the hovering lights. E whispered into the line, "It's a signal." At 12:31, the harbor erupted in sound, not from above, but beneath. A deep, resonant vibration rolled through the city, shaking every window, every steel beam, every bone in Leela's body. The lights suspended above the water pulsed in unison, their glow intensifying until the storm itself seemed to dim around them. "E," she whispered, "what's happening?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, "I think we're being answered." At 12:44, lightning tore across the entire skyline, turning the harbor into molten silver for a single, blinding second. And in that flash, Leela saw it deep beneath the surface, moving, vast and dark, its edges traced faintly by the glowing orbs spiraling around it. Something enormous was waking. At 12:52, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than sound, heavier than thunder. Even the rain seemed to hesitate midair. Then, through her headphones, E's voice came one last time, hushed, reverent. Leela, look at the water. She turned slowly to the studio window. The puddles outside were perfectly still, their glassy surfaces holding reflections of a city that didn't match their own. At 12:59, the ON air light flickered once, twice, then steadied. Leela leaned closer to the microphone, her voice steady, soft, certain. Friends, we are not alone tonight. The harbor has woken, and it knows our names. The rain kept falling, but Harbor City was listening now, and something beneath the water was listening back.